we now have a situation brewing in China that is getting very sketchy very fast. The Chinese, in reaction to the late November, early December protest that eventually involved millions of people, have decided to start loosening their regulations on social control that are COVID related. And it's leading to a fast outbreak that is going to be very difficult to put numbers on, much less policy. The Chinese have discontinued their use of their social monitoring app for COVID, which a lot of people thought it was never going to go away because it was great for social control, but they've got other methods for doing it, so I was never really overly concerned there. If you got mild symptoms, you can recover from home rather than having to go to a quarantine clinic, and the quarantine clinics are about what you would expect from a government institution where people don't have a choice where they can go. They were basically prisons that had a modicum of medical assistance, and they were not particularly hygienic, and a lot of people got co-infections that came from their times there. There's also room now for provincial and local governments to set and lessen restrictions of their own for the first times. And we are seeing a general mobilization of the health system across the Chinese system to deal with the anticipated surge in cases. And it's wildly, wildly insufficient. What we're seeing there is something going down that is very similar to what the United States went through back when we had our Omicron outbreak in January and February of 2022. Anyway, lots of businesses are closed. A lot of the testing facilities are closed because they can't find enough workers who are not infected to do the tests in the first place. So China's data has always been sketchy at best, and now in many cases they're not even attempting to generate it. We're also seeing significant shortages of common pharmacy items and drugs and anything you'd use to treat flu-like symptoms. The scale of what's coming is kind of difficult to wrap your mind around. So the United States has 330 million people. And one of the common criticisms of the American healthcare system, which is accurate, is that our healthcare system is awful at actually keeping people healthy, but it's excellent at providing critical care. The Chinese system is not good at keeping people healthy either, and it sucks at providing critical care. And in the case of the United States, with our 330 million people, we still lost over 1 million citizens over the 3 years of the epidemic to date. Now, the Chinese deaths to this point have been a rounding error because the Chinese have succeeded in keeping the general population away from the virus, and they, deserve some kudos for that. But the Chinese population is not nearly as healthy as the American population, if you can imagine that. On average, the population is older, has been for about a decade, and if some new data revisions that they're working on prove true, probably closer to 2. And in relative terms, more Chinese are diabetic than Americans, and that has generally proven to be like the number one comorbidity factor when you're looking at COVID. And all of a sudden, this is all going down at once. I think that the best way to think about this is if you think about the American COVID experience through 2020, 2021, and 2022, things came in phases. We were first exposed to the original virus, and then we had Alpha, and then we had Delta, and then we had Omicron. And about the time that Alpha was popping up, we were getting mass vaccination in play with mRNA vaccines that proved to be wildly effective. And so we had our initial death wave. And then we had our vaccination, and then we had the Delta death wave, and then we had this mass infection with Omicron at the beginning of this year. So pretty much everyone in the United States has now been exposed to at least one of the strains, most of us 2 or more. And most of us have gotten vaccinated, and with a plurality of those people actually getting boosted. People like me have, immunocompromised. I think I've had 5 shots now. The point is it didn't happen all at once. And we all have experienced a degree of exposure and protection. The Chinese don't have that. The Chinese vaccine was barely functional against the original wild strain out of Wuhan, and against the current Omicron Q11, I can't even remember the name of the strain. Against the current strain, it doesn't work at all. And say what you will about the Chinese health system, the lockdowns, the perpetual lockdowns, did succeed at limiting exposure, so no one has natural immunity either. So you cut all this loose at the same time, and we're talking millions of deaths, because the R0 for the current strain, what's the best way to do this? Let me compare it to measles. So measles has an R0 of 12 to 18, which means your average infected person will then go on to infect another 12 to 18 people. I have not seen an estimate out of China suggesting that the current strain is better than measles. Most indicate it's worse. There's an open question of fatality rates, and that, of course, is where the Chinese are doing their normal makeup data as they go along. They're projecting that the death rate is 100 per 100,000 infections, which would be about the same death rate you get from stubbing your toe. And that is just obviously laughable. It'd be less severe than what the flu is. More likely, we're looking at something at least 15 to 20 times that. At least that's what data from the rest of the world would suggest. So from a health point of view, what's about to happen is just horrific. We're talking probably millions of deaths in a relatively short period of time, as 3 years of exposure American style has been compressed into just a few weeks, and it was kicked off with several hundred super spreader events during the protests. So the next question, of course, comes back to politics. Chairman Xi has set up a system where, in the face of massive unrest, he's allowed a lessening of restrictions, and he's now passing the buck to local and provincial governments, allowing them to loosen and tighten policy. But in a cult of personality system, this can very quickly lead to a crisis of confidence in the ability of the government to function at all, because it's not any longer clear who is pulling the shots. You could have a nightmare scenario where a policy failure in a single province leads to out of control death rates, in which case nobody trusts the government at any level. Or from Xi's point of view, you could have the opposite happen, where a local province generates a spectacular local health policy and manages to keep COVID under control as well as keeping the economy open. That would be a direct challenge to Xi personally. More likely, we're going to see some broad-scale incompetence here, because Xi has spent the last 10 years purging the system of anyone who is capable of conscious thought. History tells us that when China spins apart, it goes down one of two ways. Number one, the center over-concentrates power, and the inefficiencies eventually bring the system down. At the moment, Xi is not going that direction. The other option is that the provinces take power because, for whatever reason, the center can't wield it, and they go their own way. And so we've got this weird moment, which is actually almost unique in Chinese history, where we clearly have a centralized imperial despot in the person of Xi Jinping. But he's refusing, for whatever reason, to use that power to control the current situation. So we can actually get the worst of both worlds here, as he lets governments have enough rope to hang themselves and then goes back in as the savior and locks everything back down. I mean, that's just one possibility here. But no matter how this goes at this point, we are talking at China being offline from a manufacturing point of view for at least the next 3 or 4 months, because it will take them that long for this current version of COVID to boil through the population. And we're already seeing mass closures of a lot of health and health adjacent systems that already can't cope. And we are still in the very, very, very early days.
We've been living in the most atypical, bizarre period in human history. The very concept of globalization, the idea that you can participate in some sort of supply chain or source some product or sell some product on the other side of the planet. This has never happened before without some degree of military control and escort. But at the end of World War II, the Americans scrapped the old imperial system that generated the war. And we said that we would patrol the global ocean so that anyone could play. You could sail anywhere at any time, interface with any partner, participate in any manufacturing, access any raw commodity, and sell into any market. If in exchange you would side with us against the Soviets, and that created the world that we know. And it sounds like just a simple guns for butter deal, but you got to remember how fractured everything was before 1945. Mm-hmm. If you were in a country that didn't have oil, then you didn't industrialize. If you were in a country that didn't have farmland, then your population was minuscule. Globalization allowed everyone to sell what they were good at and buy what they weren't good at, and everyone in the world became a specialist. And so we now have soy farms in Iowa that's most productive in the world. But we also have semiconductors coming out of Taiwan, a country that was pre-industrial by every definition until very recently. And every part of the world can play it. And that has encouraged this mass diversification, and it's encouraged this mass explosion in economic activity, particularly once the Cold War ended in 1992. But it was always artificial. And it was always based on the Americans continuing to hold up the ceiling. The United States has been edging away from that ever since 1992 when the Cold War ended, and we're in the final days of that right now. And that's only kind of half of it, because when you allow everyone to participate in global trade, people move off the farm and they take services and manufacturing jobs in town. On the farm, kids are free labor. You have a bunch. In town, kids are really, really expensive pieces of loud, annoying furniture.
Right.
Have fewer because adults aren't stupid.
Yeah.
You play that forward for 70 years, and we have had a population bust in the making, global in scope for decades now. Mm-hmm. And most of the advanced world has now aged past the point of no return. That includes countries like China. So in this coming decade, it's not just that we're going to see population aging out of being competitive. We're going to see populations aging out of being sustainable and actually being countries. One of the many, many, many outcomes of the 2020s is the end of China's unified nation state and economy. But this has all been hardwired in now for 40 years, and we are finally reaching the point where the page turns.
What will happen in 5 to 7 decades? Other countries just invade Japan's land because there's just no one there to protect it?
Every country is going to have its own story, because every country started aging at a different point, and they started aging at a different rate, and how you live in urban versus rural zones is dependent upon the local geography. So an example on the positive side, we started industrializing in the United States 200 years ago. So for us, this hasn't been a 40, 50-year process. This has been a 200-year process. And so our birth rate has dropped incrementally that entire time, but we've adapted to it as we've shifted into the cities. So the United States still today has the highest birth rate among any of the advanced worlds. We're the most slowly aging country. Mm-hmm. But if you go to a country like, say, China, that only started the industrialization process in about 1985, mm-hmm. they crammed 200 years of economic advancement into 40 years. That also means they crammed 200 years of demographic adjustment into 40 years.
Tell us what that means. I mean, we all know about the one-child policy and so forth, but what do you mean when you say they crammed that into 40 years?
So one of the reasons why the Chinese have been so economically successful in many people's eyes is because they have done 200 years of industrial development, building out industrial plant and infrastructure and power lines in a single generation.
Yep.
In the United States, we did that very slowly over the generations. We didn't finish even electrifying countryside until the 1960s.
Wow,
and so
that's amazing.
For us, we were able to adapt each step of this into our cultural evolution. That's one of the reasons why in the United States, you're far more likely to live in the suburbs than the urban cores, because we did this on a slow process and we can make adjustments and people can still have families of size in the suburbs. In the case of China, the population was already relatively high. And when they made the jump, they skipped all the intervening steps. They didn't have to develop cell or telephones that were on landlines. They skipped right to cellular.
Right. Yep.
And in doing so, they went into denser and denser footprints very, very early in the process. So you went from a subsistence farm to a high-rise condo in a generation.
Right.
And when you're in a condo, no kids. So one child, is that part of it? Absolutely.
Yeah.
But one child is the secondary factor in the Chinese demographic collapse. The single biggest one is that they all moved in small condos in a very short period of time, and everyone just stopped having kids altogether.
Yeah.
So we know now that China will cease to exist as a functional demographic structure and economy this decade, because it's not just that they ran out of children. That was 30 years ago. Mm-hmm. They're now running out of 30 seconds.
The only way to make China work is to force it to. And these many disconnects show up in Chinese institutions. The Chinese constitution is a joke. It isn't even referenced by Chinese courts. There's no rule of law. There is law by rule. And that rule is whatever Xi, the chairman, says. And he is a horrible delegator, even within the Chinese Communist Party. The COVID restrictions in play right now are part of that milieu. They all draw their authority and power not so much from the Communist Party or the Chinese state, but from Xi personally. That's how you get neighborhood HOAs enforcing COVID lockdowns so brutal that fire escapes are welded shut to ensure enforcement, ensuring that people die in easily preventable tragedies like what happened at Urumqi. Or city authorities thinking that they're doing the will of Xi and removing street signs with the word Urumqi in them because they assume that's what Xi wants in order to smother citizen awareness. If we see meaningful resistance to any Chinese policy, China goes one of two directions. Option one, you get a rolling series of government breakdowns as Xi's authority is challenged, and there's no one to step in to replace it because he has purged the system so completely. COVID is only one Chinese policy that feels a bit out of place. What about the social monitoring system that has created an information state tighter than Cold War East Germany? What about lending controls that have contributed to real estate distortions 2 orders of magnitude larger than America's subprime? What about laws against the VPNs that allow you to share your kids' photos without them being entered into a national database? What about the deliberate cultural destruction policies for the Uyghurs and Tibetans? A crack in Xi's personal authority isn't simply a crack in the facade, but a fissure to the core which would unleash a torrent of dissent that would wash away everything. We're already seeing the protests spread to non-related issues. University students are getting in on it. Opinions are being aired on dictatorship versus democracy, economic growth, housing, how good or how bad a job Xi personally is doing. In a country where any sort of common coordinated public outcry is viewed as treason, we are already hip deep. Or there's always option B. Xi puts a stop to it. Xi is a child of the Cultural Revolution, a 10-year-long internal repression so intense it killed at least 40 million people and gutted what then passed for the Chinese economy. Neither of these are great options, but both of them are emblematic of the long run of Chinese history. Either China becomes too tightly wound and controlled and it descends into an orgy of self-destruction, or central authority breaks and China spins apart in an orgy of self-destruction. And just in case you haven't been paying attention, neither of these outcomes are particularly good for business. We're now at a point where it's not so much that if you wanted to divest away from China, it's too late to do so in a way that enables you to salvage your facility. We probably passed that point over the summer. Now the issue is that if you lack an evacuation plan for your key employees, you might not be able to get them out at all. And just so no one overlooks the other issue, China's domestically generated COVID vaccines don't work against Omicron, and previous lockdowns within China have kept COVID out of the general population, so very few Chinese have any natural resistance. And now China has already experienced several days of mass super spreader events. China has higher rates of diabetes than the United States. And China's healthcare system is absolutely atrocious. It is difficult to put into words which part of what is about to happen is worse for the People's Republic.
The biggest panic, the biggest damage that we are seeing from the Ukraine war, outside of Ukraine, obviously, is in China. Because in 1 month, the Russians have pulled back the blinders on what has been a 50-year strategic program. The idea that China can become the global power with American sponsorship, with American indifference, that it can take Taiwan, that it can intimidate Japan, that it can dominate all of East Asia, and yet not suffer economically at all. It was always ridiculous, but now it's been shown to just be absolutely stupid. Now, the question moving forward, of course, is what's the next thing the United States is going to care about? And considering how erratic our politics have been for the last 15 years, that's a tough question, but it's something that every single country that trades now has to obsess about if they want to continue doing anything along the lines that they thought they could. And the yuan is only traded internally because it's the most manipulated currency in history. The euro confiscates bank deposits to pay for bailouts. Are there things that the Fed could do better, in my opinion? Of course. But compared to all the competition, I mean, there isn't any competition. Russia is the world's second largest oil exporter, and it exports via 4 main routes, one to China, one to the Baltic Sea, one to the Black Sea, and then on via pipe to Europe. What's going on right now because of the Ukraine war is that the pipes that go to Europe are going to be disrupted either by the war itself or because Ukrainian partisans are targeting Russian income flows. One way or another, those pipes aren't surviving this year. The stuff that goes to the Black Sea is in a war zone. So insurance companies will not give the indemnification that is necessary for vessels to operate in that area. So the only way a ship can go and dock at Novorossiysk right now is if a country gives it sovereign indemnification and takes all the risk. Some of that is happening with the Chinese. It might be happening with the Indians. That's a little touch and go. They're still under negotiation. Primorsk, that's the Baltic port, so right next to St. Petersburg. That is not in a war zone. So you can get insurance to go to Primorsk. However, ship captains, for the most part, are refusing to go, and European dock workers are refusing to unload the cargo when it arrives. So that is still in use, but not nearly as much, maybe a quarter of what it used to be before the war started. And then the final pipes either terminate Pacific coast near Vladivostok, or there is a short spur line that goes down into Daqing in northeastern China. The western three, Black Sea, the pipes to Europe, Baltic Sea, those are interconnected to a degree. So if there's a problem at one port or on one pipe, they can redirect some, less than a third, but some of the crew to other places. It is completely disconnected from the eastern pipes that go to China and Japan. So if all the stuff in the west is shut down, which is what I think is going to happen, none of it can go east. The rail line is already operating beyond capacity. The pipelines are already full. You would have to build a fundamentally new infrastructure from the fields in northwest Siberia to Chinese population centers. That is greater than the distance from Miami to Anchorage, most of which is through virgin territory that is very rugged. That's a 10-year program, minimum, even with the Chinese building it. So, one way or another, we are looking at those western flows, which add up to 4 to 5 million barrels a day, going offline. There's still about 1.5 million barrels refined product that might go out, but most of that is going out via rail. So that'll be a little trickier to disrupt. I figure the Europeans can maybe disrupt half of that if they really want to. But we're looking at the single largest removal of crude from the market ever. And in proportional terms, it's going to have a shock somewhat similar to World War II. And that assumes that there are no downstream effects anywhere. Because we have insurance companies not doing it, shipping companies not doing it, dock workers not doing it, and now Halliburton, Baker Hughes, and Schlumberger have pulled out, and they do the technical work that makes a lot of this possible. All the super majors are gone. We even have a couple of major projects out in Sakhalin that are probably just going to die because the Russians can't make those projects work by themselves. Most of the oil and gas out of that goes to China. So we're actually looking at an environment where the Chinese see reduced flows rather than increased, as Russia is just melon scooped out of the market. Okay, so first the splash that's in the news, second the stuff that's behind it that's actually more important, and then the third what's coming. So the splash that's in the news is going after the oligarchs. In the 1990s, a group of people took advantage of the collapse of the Soviet system and grabbed assets for themselves on any number of means. Very little of it was what we would consider illegal, or what the Russian law would consider illegal, because there wasn't a lot of Russian law then, but it was definitely unethical. And they have now become multi-billionaires. This first batch of oligarchs, when Putin came in the year 2000, he brought them to heel. He made them a deal that if they stayed completely out of politics, he would not go after their assets. And so there's been this truce between them for the last 20 years. Under Putin, he elevated a number of people from his FSB days, KGB days, based on who's doing the math, to take over large portions of the Russian economy. This includes things like the defense industry, Gazprom, which is the world's largest natural gas company, and Rosneft, which is the world's second largest oil company. And these are all people who were not part of that original group. These are people who are all in Putin's inner circle. So we're going after two different groups of oligarchs here. The ones that are around Putin, totally worth it. These are people who have been with Putin, bolted to the hip with every single policy he's done for 20 years. These people should be brought down. The other people, the folks that have been there since the 1990s, I don't mean to suggest that they're kinder, gentler folks. I mean, they are robber barons at best. But going after them just makes you feel good because they have very little influence over Putin. So we're talking here about melon scooping the entire core out of the Russian economy by going after the leadership. But one group is not going to affect the war whatsoever. And that's that first group in the 90s. They're the ones who have most of their assets overseas. So they're the ones who are actually vulnerable to what's going on. Now, behind that, we didn't just sanction a bunch of companies and people. We sanctioned the Russian central bank. And we don't think of how important a central bank is in systems because we always assume it's a neutral actor in the background that maybe messes around with interest rates and bond purchases, and that's about it. But they are the primary connectivity point between any economy and the rest of the world. One of the thousands reasons that I'm not a big fan of Bitcoin is it assumes that the central banks, A, will empower it, and B, will do nothing to impede it. And that's clearly not true. And in the case of the Russian central bank, they can no longer deal with any entity in any of these countries and access any currencies that are dollars, euros, yen, won, Australian dollars, Canadian dollars, Taiwanese dollars, and I'm sure I've met Swiss francs, and I'm sure I've left out a bunch. So anything that the bank tries to do anywhere cannot use any of those normal channels. And so among other things, that denied the Russians access to some 90% of their currency reserves. That means that when they sell oil, somebody has to physically do a transfer in a third party and fly the money into Moscow. This is not a tenable situation. We tried doing some version of this for Iran and it was crushing, but we've never done it to an economy this big or this holistically. And then what's coming? We have a number of sanctions against Russia. It's the most sanctioned country in history now. Actually, it has more sanctions on it than all other countries in all other time frames throughout human history. The Europeans are now talking about an open ban on all sales of Russian crude. Not just to the Europeans themselves, because all that would do is shift the pain. They're talking at the beginning of the process of talking about making sure that Russian crude can't make it to market anymore.